AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers. And today I have a delightful guest. His name is James Roth. He is a former undercover officer with CIA who served in Europe, the Middle East, and the South Pacific. He has an engineering degree from UCLA. And when he's not writing spy novels, he enjoys grilling in the backyard with his wife and globe-trotting daughters and some friends. He has a brand new book out, which I've read and thoroughly enjoyed. Its name is Dead Drop. Jim, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thanks for having me, Jim. My pleasure.
Jim, it's a very interesting title. What's the book about?
So there are a lot of international aspects to this novel, but the bulk of the story takes place in a quiet suburb of Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. And the story opens with a high school kid by the name of Spencer Hale, who's in a tree fort in a wooded park next to his neighborhood waiting for some friends. And as he looks out over the woods to try to spot his friends coming, he happens to see a strange man who looks very out of place, who goes along one of the park trails. And as he approaches a footbridge over a stream, he stops, bends over, and places a package in the brush. And then he wanders off, and before he leaves the park, he appears to place something on the back of a park sign. So Spencer of course, finds this very curious. And so when his friends arrive, he gets them to go with him, and they retrace this guy's steps, hoping to figure out what he was up to. When they get to the bridge, they find in the brush a plastic coffee container that at first glance appears to be empty. But they bring it back to the fort, and when they examine it further, they find that it has a hidden compartment containing a wad of cash and a typewritten letter of instructions from a foreign intelligence service to an anonymous mole in the U.S. government. And of course, the kids are stunned by this. They're not old enough to really understand what everything in the letter meant, but they're smart enough to understand that they've stumbled into a spy operation. And as they are talking over in the fort what to do about this and who to report it to, it occurs to them that if this is a spy operation, then one of their neighbors might very well be involved. And this neighbor is an old Russian guy by the name of Pavel Fedorov, who is rumored within the neighborhood to be a Russian spy. And the kids have always ignored these rumors, considering it malicious gossip. But now they kind of have to reevaluate that. And one of the kids is especially adventuresome, and he convinces the other three, against their better judgment, to take matters into their own hands and see if they can identify some sort of link between Fedorov and the package they found. And of course, that decision has big consequences, and the kids very quickly find themselves in the middle of a dangerous international spy operation and having to navigate the adult world of espionage, guided by an unlikely ally, I'll say. So that's the premise.
Who are some of the other principal characters in the book?
So aside from the ones I mentioned, one of the other main characters is the U.S. government mole. And this book is not a whodunit, Jim. The mole is revealed very early in the story. And I've always been interested by the psychology of treason, especially treason committed against the U.S. government, because we're the good guys, right? And so in this story, it traces this guy's evolution from being a mid-level, kind of mediocre but very ambitious intelligence officer to finding himself in circumstances where he decides to commit treason. And it kind of explores his complex motives for doing that. Also, a couple other characters. There is a seasoned CIA case officer. There is the head of counter-espionage for the CIA's Russia House. And finally, there is the nosy next-door neighbor of Fedorov, a woman named Mrs. Prattle, who is the source of all the neighborhood rumors that Fedorov is a spy, and who takes her neighborhood watch role very seriously. And the result is she gets involved in some of this a little bit as well. And by the way, I should mention, as I describe the premise for this story and the fact that there are four teenagers at the center of the story, it may sound like it's a book intended for kids, but it really isn't. A friend of mine who was a case officer, after reading it, he said, this should be marketed as John le Carré meets Stand By Me. And of course, Stand By Me is a movie from back in the 1980s that was based on a book by Stephen King called The Body. And in that story follows four kids who, over the course of a summer, go on a trek to find a dead body that they've heard about. And when they finally come across it, they have to deal with the consequences of that. And that story, and movie, were intended for more of an adult audience, even though it was about kids. And the same is true with my book.
What inspired you to write a spy novel?
Well, I've always been interested in writing a novel since way back when I was very young. And then, of course, when I went into the CIA, that interest became more specifically to write a spy novel. And so over the years, I would kick around plot ideas with my wife, Kelly, but I never really did anything about it. And then finally, the idea for this story came about with the arrest of Robert Hanssen. And I'm sure your audience is mostly familiar with the Hanssen case, but just for background, Bob Hanssen was a career FBI special agent who specialized in counterintelligence. And for the better part of 2 decades, he spied against the United States for the Soviet Union and later for Russia. And he was finally arrested, I think it was in early 2002. And when the details of this came out, I was really intrigued by it because Hanssen, he was very devious. When he volunteered his services to the Soviet Union, and he did it anonymously. And I guess the idea was that if his KGB handlers didn't know his true identity, it would be a lot harder for him ever to get caught. And so, and because of that, because he was protecting his identity, the way the case was handled was he never met with his handlers in person. So the relationship was handled through what we would call impersonal communications. And that is to say, dead drops and signals. And a lot of those dead drops and signals took place in public parks of Northern Virginia. And in fact, I found it interesting that Hanssen and the Russians often used the same parks repeatedly and even the same dead drop sites repeatedly, which is not the greatest tradecraft in the world. But when I found out about all this, I thought, what might have happened if some ordinary people were spending time in one of those parks in Virginia and had stumbled across a dead drop package, opened it up, and found spy materials inside, and then decided to take matters into their own hands? What might have happened there? And I mentioned this to my wife, and as I said, she knew that I was interested in writing a spy novel. So she said, well, there's your story. You should write that. And it took me a while to get around to it. And every few years, Kelly would nudge me about it. But I was working full time, raising a family. And I guess if I'm being honest, it also would have taken time away from my very bad golf game. But so finally, a few years ago, as I was getting close to retirement, Kelly said, that's too good of a story not to write. And if you're not going to write it, I'm going to do it. And my wife knows how to push my buttons, and I think she would have made a good case officer. So it worked, and I finally sat down and wrote the novel, and the result is The Dead Drop.
Well, it's a great story about domestic counterintelligence, counterespionage.
Thank you.
When you set out to write the book, was it simply to entertain, or were you thinking about educating the U.S. public as well?
That's a really interesting question, Jim. And as far as the education part, I guess the answer is sort of, but not really. So when I sat down and started outlining this book, this story. My goal was to write one that, of course, was entertaining, but also one that was plausible and based on the real world of espionage. And it wasn't so much because I wanted to educate readers as it was because I've always thought, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this as well. I've always thought that the real world of spying is far more interesting than how it's portrayed typically in Hollywood movies or in most spy novels. I think that any good spy story requires a lot of tension in order to be good. And I think that a good writer creates that tension by creating an interesting set of characters, putting them into challenging circumstances, and then having them to have to overcome obstacles to achieve whatever their goals are. And I think Hollywood's approach to creating that sort of tension is typically to have kind of a series of action scenes. And so they use a lot of car chases and assassinations and shootouts and things like that. And that's fine. And it can be very entertaining. But I also think that it's a little cliche and a little artificial and not really necessary because the real world is more interesting, the real world of spying. And so you and I know, I think that at the core of any big spy operation is going to be some very complex, intense, covert relationships, right? Especially those between case officers and their assets. And so if you look at it from that perspective, the asset is often, not always, but often committing treason against his own government. And when he decides to spy, when he decides to take that plunge, he's putting a lot of faith and trust in the hands of his case officer to protect him from arrest and maybe even execution. And from the flip side, from a case officer's perspective, their primary obligation is to run the operation securely, knowing all along that any flawed tradecraft or bad decision or any misstep at all could lead to the end of the operation and the asset. And that's pretty good tension, right? I think that makes for good stories. And so I wanted to show all of those aspects of the real world of spying, along with what I think in espionage, the most operations involve elements of trust and betrayal and deception and manipulation, egos, and a lot of ambiguity. And so anyway, I wanted to show all that, and it really didn't even occur to me till after I'd written it that some people might find it educational. And a friend of mine who read the book and had no background in intelligence said to me, he said, before I read the book, I'd never even heard the word tradecraft before. And he said, now I'll never forget it. So I thought, okay, good. It's educational. Great. That's even better.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Jim, for any of us who have slunk around the back alleys of world capitals in the dark of night, particularly if you've done a several-hour surveillance detection route on your way in and then another one on your way back from the meeting, there's a lot of tension.
Yes.
And particularly if you're conducting what we call denied area operations in hostile environments.
Exactly.
Your asset is at risk of death. And even the case officer is at risk of being pretty badly beaten up and thrown in jail for a while until somebody comes and rescues us. So there is a lot of tension in those relationships and those operations, but it takes real skill to describe them. And I don't think Hollywood gets it very often.
I don't think they do. And sometimes I'm not really sure whether they care to or not. I think they look at it's a copycat world, right? In Hollywood, I think. And so it's become kind of formulaic. And I think that they figure, well, if people are going to watch it and they like it, we'll keep going with it. And I think that's great. But I think they're missing the boat.
So were there aspects of your career that help you choose kind of venue or aspects of tradecraft?
Yeah, so I think my background definitely influenced the type of story I wrote and the tradecraft involved in that story. So I came into the agency in late 1983, pretty much right out of college. And of course, that was during the Cold War period. And I majored in engineering at UCLA. And about halfway through my engineering studies there, I thought, I really don't want to be an engineer. I want to work for the CIA. And it was really too late to change my major, but I thought, okay, what can I do to make myself a better candidate to get hired? And I wasn't really sure what that was, but I figured, okay, our primary adversary is the Soviet Union. And if I learn as much as I can about the Soviet Union, maybe it'll help me get hired. So I studied Russian language for a year in college and took courses in Soviet government and Russian history. And I guess it worked because I got hired. And then after I went through training in the CIA, I was placed in the Soviet division. And so I spent the first big chunk of my career focused on Soviet and later Russian operations. And so that had a big impact on me. And I've always been fascinated by the Cold War. And so it was kind of natural for me to write a story that included some of that. And even though my story doesn't take place during the Cold War, as it's a contemporary novel, it takes place today. There are flashback scenes in the story that go back to the 1980s, fictional events that of the Cold War that influenced the events that I was recounting in the novel that took place decades later. So I guess you'd say it takes place against the backdrop of the Cold War. And I think the tradecraft was consistent with how we did things in those days.
And I miss some of those days.
Me too.
Jim, as I mentioned to you off camera, we actually have multiple audiences for these programs, not just retired intelligence officers, but also academic audiences. What advice would you give to young Americans who might be thinking about a career in intelligence?
Yeah, Jim. So as you can probably tell from this conversation, I think that a career in intelligence, it's hard to find anything that's more interesting or anything where you can make as valuable a contribution to U.S. national security interests. So I highly recommend it, first of all, for anybody who's interested to look into it, especially if they're like me. When I was young, when I was just getting out of college, I think my biggest fear was that I would end up in a career that would be boring. And fortunately, that didn't happen. And I think the CIA is a great option for anybody who has that type of personality. But you and I know the CIA is not for everybody. And when you and I joined the agency decades ago, there really wasn't much information out there about how the CIA accomplished its mission or what the different career tracks were there. And of course, now it's very different. There's a ton of information out there. And I think young people should take advantage of that if they're interested in informing themselves about what a career there is like. And that can start with something as simple as looking at the CIA website, and where you can find short descriptions of different career tracks. Everything from case officers and targeting officers in the Directorate of Operations to analysts in the Directorate of Intelligence to technology careers on the S&T side. So there's a lot out there. And I think that anybody who's especially interested in the operational or analytical side should take time to prepare themselves for a career, for being a good candidate for being hired. And the obvious thing to do there is to keep up with world events, to follow reporting on international politics and diplomacy and military events, and try to understand how those events impact U.S. national security. And then one other thing that I think is probably worth mentioning is I think it's worth taking the time to try to train yourself to be objective in taking in all this news information that we get bombarded with. If you're a case officer or an analyst, you spend a lot of time at work evaluating raw intelligence reports, right? As a case officer, you might be doing that to vet your assets. As an analyst, you might be doing that to connect the dots and understand a situation better. And oftentimes we would come across contradictory information. That was a frequent thing where you might get reports from two different assets reporting on the exact same subject, but saying very different things that contradict each other. And then you have to figure it out. You have to be very objective and look at it and say, well, is my asset reliable? Is the reporting accurate? And we learn how to do that through training, and even more so just experience on the job. But I think young people today can teach themselves to do it very simply. And one way to do that, I think, is as you're following news around the world, get your information from multiple news sources, not just one. And as you do that, look at how they cover the same events differently, whether it's the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza, for example, how they report things differently, and look for contradictions, and then try to understand why those contradictions happen. Whether, for example, one newspaper's editorial policy might bias them to report in a certain direction. Look at who's being cited in news reporting as sources. Are they sources who are cited by name and going on the record, or are they anonymous sources? And if they are cited by name, look at who they are, what their access to information is, what their expertise is, and try to understand, are they genuinely trying to inform the public or the reporter they're talking to? Or do they maybe, because of their circumstances, because of who they are, is it possible that they're trying to influence public perceptions or other government perceptions? So anyway, those are just a few things that I think young people can do to prepare for a career in intelligence.
Very well said, Jim.
Thank you.
I must say, one of the best things about my career, and there were many good things, was that it was never boring.
Never.
No 2 days were the same. No 2 assignments were the same. Every day was different. If you were doing your job right, you were always learning. You were always responding to a new set of circumstances. And for me, that was great.
Yeah, it's a great career.
Yeah. Well, the book is called Dead Drop. It is a fascinating read, both entertaining and educational. And I recommend it to our audiences. And I want to thank Jim Ross for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks for having me, Jim. I enjoyed it.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.